Professor Stephen Grobard.
I am very taken with your idea of an Anglo-American genius. But what I miss in all your talk is what I call Anglo-American differences. A Revolutionary War, a War of 1812, a great dubiety on the part of the British about the value of the northern side in the Civil War. We owe so much to a man named Gladstone. Great dubieties at the end of the century about our policies in Latin America and elsewhere. Only in the First World War did these two rivals, and they were rivals, they weren't friends, did these two rivals join together. And then, even then, as you know, there were great dubieties, both not so much there as here, as to whether they should join together. What I'm asking is, what attention do you give to that continuing historical rivalry and difference? Because they were different societies. That is how Walter Bagehot saw it. That is how Carlyle saw it. That is how every major 19th century intellectual in Britain saw it. How do you treat those differences?
Well, I suppose I actually treat them a little bit more in the preface to the UK edition, which is coming out in November.
Coming to a bookstore near you if you live 6,000 miles from here, yes.
Grove Atlantic. You know, I mean, your points are well taken. In fact, where I do touch on this most clearly is I point out that, you know, what the British did to the Dutch in the wars against Louis XIV was that with one hand they defended the Netherlands from France, and with the other they picked the Dutch pockets. And so at the end of the French wars, the British emerged running a system that the Dutch had really started. This is very much what the United States did to the British in World War II. With one hand, we defended them from Hitler and others. With the other, we very seriously went to work deconstructing the British Empire. And Keynes used to talk about his job in trying to negotiate with the United States was to keep the United States from plucking out the eyes of the British Empire during the war. But we plucked them. And I think Roosevelt, by the way, Franklin Roosevelt, who was from an old Dutch family who came here when it was still New Amsterdam, was aware of the irony and sort of enjoyed doing to the British what they had once done to the Dutch. And very much the U.S. and the British, we haven't acted together. In a sense, we sort of only come together when someone sort of attacks us both. And Churchill talked about two peoples divided by a common language. I think you can also talk about two peoples divided by a common culture, two peoples divided by a common history.
Richard Gardner.
Walter, I'm in agreement with your central thesis, but rather surprised that you don't mention the three global institutions which are the result of Anglo-American cooperation during and immediately after the Second World War. The World Bank, the IMF, the GATT, now WTO. The amazing thing is that those institutions were essentially the product of a negotiation between two countries, the US, UK. The end of the Second World War, there were perhaps 24 members of the two. Now they're global. 170 members, I think, of the IMF, World Bank, 151 of the WTO. Question, if we wish these institutions to continue to be purveyors of this unique and valuable culture, isn't there a challenge to make their legitimacy greater? As long as the United States insists on the presidency of the World Bank, the Europeans insist on the presidency of the managing director of the IMF, and not bring in the Asians with recognizing the shift in the world balance of power. And Putin even suggested that the IMF managing director should be a Czech, and that was rejected. To make this viable, don't these uniquely valuable global institutions have to modernize in that way?
Well, I'm not so sure Putin would be thrilled if we suggested a Pole for the presidency of the IMF. A Czech might be okay, but a Pole he probably wouldn't go for. I do think, or worse yet, an Estonian, I think. But I do agree with you that these institutions need to change. And And that's one of the problems with institutions. They're very hard to change. I would go further, and I look at the UN Security Council and say that, you know, it's absurd that a majority of the permanent seats in the UN Security Council go to countries that are not only European states, but are sort of retired world powers rather than active ones in some cases. And that looking at the future, one would imagine that the UN Security Council probably ought to have an EU member, the United States, India, China, and then Japan, I suppose, maybe Russia. But in any case, it's a, you know, how we can change these institutions to reflect changing conditions is a major issue that's before us. And obviously, we just can't go in and impose the changes we want. My guess is that over time, realistically, we will see a shift of institutional power in these world systems, essentially from Europe to Asia. That's one that's needed. But obviously, it's going to be resisted sometimes.
I'm sure it's only a question of time before the French and the British voluntarily give up their seats to a united EU seat. And
I'm waiting for the day.
Sir, just wait for the microphone.
Amar Bede, Columbia University. Following up on a prior question to push on the differences between the US and the UK. There are also material differences if one is to believe Alfred Chandler in the kind of capitalism between the US and the UK. That the UK system was very much, as you describe, a trade-oriented maritime system. The US was very much a system based on exploiting economies of scale and scope. And in that sense, the US capitalism had much more in common with Germany and Japan than it did have with the UK. And the UK, in that sense, had much more in common with Portugal and Holland. And following these differences, there were also differences in the kinds of ideologies and policies, which is that the UK was much more interested in free trade, the US was not. So how do you lump all these things? I mean,
well, what I say there is that, what I would say is that it's certainly true that when the U.S. wasn't running the system and we were an emerging power within it, we had very much a sense of trying also to protect ourselves from, you know, from sort of British competition and so on, and to organize our internal market. But as Britain gradually sort of failed in the 20th century and the U.S. had to step in, what you found was we moved from being protectionist to being free trade. The proportion of our economy that was linked with trade has risen. We've become much more global in all kinds of dimensions. So that, in a sense, what happened was the United States, under the British umbrella, developed the abilities that then, when that umbrella was gone, allowed the United States to replace it. So I'd say there's, among other things, an issue of historical sequencing. But again, to say that Britain and America are more similar to each other, say, than most other sets of two countries would be that don't share so much common history, culture, and civilization, is by no means to say they're identical. And their histories have diverged. I think that the key divergence for me actually takes place in the 18th century when the British, under the sort of Hanoverians, moved toward, and under the pressure of the wars with France, moved toward a much more centralized, much more sort of establishment-oriented, even much more elitist kind of way. That British society looked more American in some ways in 1700 than it did in 1800. And the Americans rejected the kind of Walpole movement toward that kind of government, and were sort of like the real Whigs in the UK. So they're very different. We're still much more Cromwellian, and they're still much more Anglican in the way that they think about things. But these, it seems to me, are sort of family differences, the differences between siblings or the differences between cousins. And there's still, and it's very important, without neglecting the differences, it's very important to understand, I think, the extremely deep similarities. For example, operating under a system of common law is one of the key ones. That really has shaped a certain historical reality that's felt not only by us, but other people around the world see a great deal of resemblance between the Americans and the British, although they also see differences.
Got time for just a couple of more questions. Ted Soren.